My name is Amanda Mitchell, and this is my presentation on the communication theory of symbolic interactionism, with a particular focus on the role of language in a shared system of meaning. To get started, I just want to define some of the terms that are foundational to this theory. First off is going to be the concepts of mind, self, and society. These are the three basic concepts in needs theory. To quote our textbook, Little John and Foss, they defined mind as a process. It's the interaction you have with yourself. The self is who you are as a person, and then society arises from the interlinked conversations among individuals. So those three things are foundational to the theory of symbolic interactionism. The next term I want to talk about is the social act. It's the three-part relationship between an initial gesture from one person, the response from another person, and then a result. Now, the third term I want to go over is meaning, and that typically is going to be the result of the social act. It's the result of those three pieces that go into a social act working together to create a meaning. An example from our text is the example of a robber who indicates to his victim, "I want your money." And the victim responds by giving him the money, and then the result or the meaning of what occurred is a holdup. And then the fourth term I just want to briefly go over and define for the purpose of this presentation is language. For our purposes, language is uniquely human, so it's the way that we commonly interact with each other, and how symbolic interactionism can occur. It's through language. That's how we interact with each other. That's how we form shared meaning. According to Chris Frankovich, as you can see from the quote on the screen, language is very important to symbolic interactionism. He says that it is only through language that a self can be born, and only through a self that language can be uttered. The social act is both the midwife of language and its constant framing background. So, next, what do scholars already know about this theory? First of all, society gives individuals consciousness of self. Social or symbolic interactionism focuses on the relationship between people and society, and through this interaction is how we become aware of who we are and who the self is, or it's how we develop our consciousness of the self. Again, according to Chris Frankovich, Mead argues that all forms exist in a social context that gives birth to individuality, specialization of function, and eventually for humans, consciousness and selfhood. Something else that scholars already know is that action within symbolic interactionism produces interpretation. According to Bloomer, another main figure in the theory of symbolic interactionism, he gave the example of shaking a fist. Now, that in and of itself isn't saying anything, but the interpretation of it indicates, an attack or a sign of aggression. And then the third thing that scholars already know is that the self interacting with society is what produces shared meaning. It's a dynamic back and forth. The self is constantly inputting into society, and society is constantly inputting itself back onto the self. And it's through that constant flux that we have shared meaning. It's how things such as cultures arise. It's how you have a group of people that come to understand things in similar ways. Now, are there any gaps in knowledge in this theory? When I was doing my research there, I came across a couple of articles that wanted to explore the Darwinistic influences, particularly on how language has evolved, how culture is evolving. And there's a lot of different directions that you can go within that. I didn't explore it too far for the purpose of this presentation and this project. But there are some gaps as far as people wanting to apply deterministic influences on people and in how society is created through the theory of symbolic interactionism. But I just wanted to bring that up as one direction that scholars have gone in. But there is scholarly consensus within the theory of symbolic interactionism. For one thing, symbolic interactionism, it's completely dependent upon human interaction. Another thing is that people are affected by society while simultaneously affecting society itself, and we kind of went over that already. But another thing that may be kind of unfortunate that scholars typically concur on within this theory is that it's a very pragmatic attitude, and that meaning is not necessarily objective. As you can see, symbolic interactionists focus on the constant flux. It's constantly changing, the self interacting with society and the society interacting with the self. And so in their eyes, meaning is not objective. It's not a final thing that people arrive at. It's something that is created, and it's subjective depending on the people in those situations and the society that the people are interacting with. And so that leads me into areas of debate. For us as Christians, it's fairly important to be critical of that idea. There's a lot of debate over the objectivity of meaning. It's important for us to recognize that meaning and truth are not necessarily the same thing in these cases. Truth is objective, and it's rooted in the character of God. Now, how you want to apply that knowledge to how shared meaning is created, there's a few different ways that you could go with that, but it's important to make that distinction and to recognize that although within this theory, meaning may not be completely objective in the same, people may not arrive at the same conclusions, that doesn't mean that there is not an ultimate source of truth, and that's what we should be rooting all of our research on. Another area that scholars debate about, it's the function of the self in society. The debate is whether the self is a process or a structure and how that should be viewed. Mead particularly definitely saw the self as a process. As we can see in our brief overview so far, the self, it's constantly forming and changing and interacting. But there are others that want to see the self as an established structure within society. According to Clagett, he states that the self is a relatively stable organization, which constitutes a dynamic, ever-changing, symbolic integration of structuring influences that articulate the actor's interactional experiences. So for him, and for more modern scholars, they're starting to move away from the self as being a completely ununderstandable, ever-changing process to more of a structure. This is the given, the self is there, how do we arrange everything else around it in the theory of symbolic interactionism. So, a couple of problems that affect the research of this theory. First is if you want to recognize interaction as symbolic versus non-symbolic. To break it down very simply, symbolic interaction requires an interpretation, as with the example of the robber and the holdup. That would be an example of symbolic interaction because it required the interpretation of what is happening. Non-symbolic interaction is going to be, it's not going to require interpretation. It's going to be much more straightforward. This is what happened and that is what it is. Another problem that affects research that you just need to decide how you want to deal with it is social structures. During my research, power was a social structure that was a problem for some researchers. They sought to understand how symbolic interactionism could explain something so complex as power structures within society. But the important thing is that social structures, They are important and they need to be recognized. They can't just be dismissed within the theory of symbolic interactionism. It's the framework of our society, and it lays the foundation and the landscape of where this interaction is going to take place. And for me, I see language as a part of that social structure. It's part of the framework that we have for these interactions to occur. And then finally, the role of language. Just basically, language, it's the most convenient method for humans to interact with each other, and it's foundational to symbolic interactionism. Without language, without that ready means of people interacting with others, I don't believe, and I believe Frankovich would agree, that the self cannot be fully realized without the use of language. And just finally, the self, it's a uniquely human creation, and it is from language that we are able to do that, which I would also argue is uniquely human. But thank you. This was my presentation on the communication theory of symbolic interactionism. If you have any questions, please feel free to post it on the group discussion board. Thank you.